If you've ever played a 3D game before, there's a big chance some aspect of it can be drawn back to one of the most influential video games ever made, Super Mario 64. It's a game synonymous with the early days of 3D gaming, and from then has brought forth the modern 3D gaming today. There's a lot to be said about Super Mario 64, and there's also many people who have said those things already. But if you don't got the time to spare and still want some Super Mario 64 goodness, then boy, have I got an incredible tale for you. Our story begins in 1993. Nintendo is still on top of the gaming market with their Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The console war between Nintendo and Sega is still ramping up, and most notably for our story is the year Nintendo released a little game by the name of Star Fox. Now this was no ordinary Super Nintendo game, because powered by Argonaut Software's FX chip, the game could display fully 3D graphics at a playable frame rate. 3D games had actually existed long before Star Fox in arcades, but for a market as wide as the Super Nintendo's, this was one of the first times people ever saw a 3D game before. This was most importantly where Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda, had his first interaction with a three-dimensional video game. After seeing the 3D graphics displayed on the console hardware, he knew that this was the future of video games. Right out of the gate, he knew that he wanted to make a Super Mario game using this technology. But fast forward a couple of years and that revolutionary technology would soon become a mainstay and a standard in the gaming market. But how could this happen before Nintendo even entered the 3D era? The answer is simple. Competitors beat them to it. Out of the blue, both Sega and Sony released their own consoles prioritizing 3D hardware starting in 1994, and later made their way to the US the following year. They brought 3D gaming across the world, making Nintendo's new Yoshi's Island game look dated and out of the times due to its use of 2D gameplay. Sony really capitalized on the 3D craze and popularized the use of the CD. They ruled the 5th generation of consoles at that time, and this made people ask, where was Nintendo's 3D console? Where was the long-awaited 3D Mario game? Well, people wouldn't have to ask that question for long, because in November of 1995, Nintendo showed off their 3D collaboration with Silicon Graphics, the Nintendo 64 console, and the game of the age, Super Mario 64. The development of this game had actually been going on for a while now, but as like most influential video games, extra time was needed to really pin down what the game was gonna be like. Making a 3D game in that time was no easy task, and what made it harder was staying true to the previous 2D Mario games. Many elements like coins, Goombas, Koopas, 1-ups, and a Rescue the Princess storyline were all translated from previous Mario games into this 3D rendition. But how do you translate something like jumping on a Goomba from 2D into 3D? Adding a whole new dimension to the same flat television screen complicates every aspect of development, and even requires new solutions, such as a shadow, to make seeing Mario's position and the position of other objects much more intuitive while in midair. When all of Mario's diverse movements had been meticulously created in the 3D software, the time came to finally make the levels, which would have to be heavily altered when compared to the previous games in order to fit the game on the Nintendo 64's 64MB cartridge. There was an originally planned 32 total courses for the game, which were planned to be progressed through linearly, with one start point and one end point. But when it became obvious that it was not feasible to fit 32 unique levels on a single cartridge, the developers were faced with a dire problem on how to make enough content for the game when they figured out they can only fit half of that amount on the cartridge alone. But how do you add more content to a level that's progressed from start to end? A simple method game developers can use to solve that problem is adding in secret collectibles. Objects that are collected by going off the beaten path of a traditionally designed linear level to find hidden objectives that are designed into the level itself. The idea itself is genius, but that concept was taken to a whole new level in Super Mario 64, for instead of having additional collectibles when traversing a level, the level designers implemented in additional endpoints, or stars, that when collected brought you outside the level and gave you the option to go back in and search for more. Thus, the 3D collectathon genre was born, a way of designing levels that flourished exclusively in the early days of 3D gaming and is still even in moderate use today. This concept is what saved Super Mario 64 and allowed the game developers to fit over 100 of the 120 total stars into 15 courses alone. If you ask me, I'd say that's one of the biggest ideas Super Mario 64 pioneered. But if you ask me what the biggest concept the game pioneered was, I, and most people you'd probably ask, would say the controls. One of the biggest things early 3D games are infamous for is having bad controls. Bad camera movement, poor character utilization. These were the first times people have ever done things like this in 3D, so of course it makes sense why it wasn't as polished than a game that came out, say, 8 years ago. But what about Super Mario 64? How well does it fare in these areas when you compare them to other games? Well, you can't really bash its camera system too hard, since the camera system and its manipulation from the controller itself was the very first iteration of its kind. No other 3D game before Super Mario 64 had a camera that can be manipulated at any time and any place. Okay, maybe not every place, but nevertheless, these things made Super Mario 64 stand out from all other games at the time, not to mention the thumbstick on the Nintendo 64 controller. That simple addition to the gaming controller revolutionized the way 3D games could be played, all the way to influencing Sony to add a thumbstick to their very own controller that very next year. And let me remind you, Sony was beating Nintendo in the console market during this time. Yeah, that's just how influential Nintendo was when it came to console development. There were technological advances being made left and right when this game was being made, but the more time they spent polishing up the controls, the less time they had to finish the overall game itself. Their original deadline of a holiday season 1995 release became virtually impossible unless they released an unfinished game like Sega did with Sonic 06. The president of Nintendo in that time knew that the finished game that was released later in time was much less of a burden than an unfinished game released earlier. So when Shigeru Miyamoto said that the game would not be able to be completed for a holiday season of 1995 release, the president of the company allotted him 4 extra months to complete the game, and 2 more on top of that when the game still wasn't complete at that time either. Super Mario 64 ended up being finally released on June 23, 1996 in Japan, and on September 29th that same year for America. And as you can guess from all the hype surrounding the game, it was a smash hit upon release, in basically all regions that received it. I guess you could say it really was worth the wait. After 3 years of development, 2 years of competition, and just 1 year of waiting, Mario's first outing in 3D was now available to purchase and enjoy in the sanctity of your own home. The game quickly became the best seller on the Nintendo 64. As reported by some consumers, it was one of the main reasons why they bought the console in the first place. This really does reflect the way Nintendo did business back then, making impressive games to sell their hardware instead of impressive hardware to sell their games. Like I said before, Sony was beating Nintendo to a pulp in the console market back then, partially due to the fact that Sony had started a year prior to the release of the Nintendo 64. So how exactly did Nintendo do when they finally got around to entering the 3D generation of consoles? Well, Super Mario 64 and the Nintendo 64 sold great with Nintendo fans and families, mainly due to its friendly nature and multiplayer capabilities. But Sony and their PlayStation opened up a whole new market for their type of gaming. The experienced gamers, the teen gamers, and the cool kids. It's just like what Sega was doing to Nintendo earlier that decade, marketing their Genesis to look like the cool console and making Nintendo look like a childish brand for babies. Unfortunately for Nintendo, Sony's approach was very successful, along with their use of CD technology, which made releasing games on their console much more feasible when compared to the N64's limited cartridges. It looked like Nintendo and their Mario franchise was on the way out, and Sony was on the way in. But just as you would think that all hope for Nintendo was lost, let me remind you that we have yet to cover the incredible impact of the game, because the impact of Super Mario 64 most definitely outlived the original cartridge, the Nintendo 64, and the whole 3D console generation itself. Shortly after the release of Mario 64 and the Nintendo 64, thumbsticks became the norm for navigating in 3D games. Most game developers, including Nintendo themselves, reused the collectathon concept when designing future 3D platformers. You can see this concept used in games like Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and even later in Super Mario Sunshine for the GameCube. The game even went as far as to get a full remaster with added content as a launch game for the hugely successful Nintendo DS, called Super Mario 64 DS. Koopa's Road, the theme for the Bowser levels in Mario 64, got a complete orchestrated recreation for the Bowser Galaxies in Super Mario Galaxy, along with a recreation of Whomp's Fortress for a galaxy in Super Mario Galaxy 2, rightly named Throwback Galaxy, complete with a jazz remix of the Bomb on Battlefield theme, which is the exact song you're hearing in the background right now. All of this to say, Super Mario 64 had a huge impact on the Mario franchise, especially in the 3D games. Even after the N64 and GameCube eras were over, people were still popping up to talk about the good times and nostalgia they had for the game, especially on the internet. Did you know that the second video on YouTube to include gameplay of a mainline Mario game was of Super Mario 64? Did you know that the backwards long jump, or BLJ, a glitch from Super Mario 64, is one of the most infamous and well-known video game glitches in the world? It also has one of the biggest speedrunning communities in the entirety of video gaming. Even if you're a Mario fan that's never played Super Mario 64 or have even seen any gameplay of it, you still probably know it exists just because of how big of an influence it's had on the gaming landscape. The game is so beloved that some people took the characters and locations from the game and created original stories with them, making edits of the Super Mario 64 game called Super Mario 64 Bloopers, a format that was invented in the early days of YouTube and is still a popular content structure today. Stuff like this had nothing to do with Nintendo, and was created exclusively by the fans of the original game. And that says a lot about a game when it's just as popular, or more so today, than it was in the early days of YouTube, or even back when the game was first released. All of the influence, novelty, and sheer appreciation for Super Mario 64 can be culminated in the choice by Nintendo to add a special outfit for Mario in Super Mario Odyssey, the original 3D model used in Super Mario 64, for a side quest that leads you to an actual garden seen in the original game. I know that Super Mario Odyssey is 8 years old as of this year, but that celebration is just as relevant today as it was when the game was first released. The thing is, Super Mario 64 has never lost its influence on modern gaming, and never will depending on what century you're watching this video in. That just has to do with what the game accomplished when you compare it to the gaming landscape of the time. It re-envisioned what a 3D game could be back in its day, what people could do with the game during the storytime age of YouTube, and what you can learn from our current culture from the creative individuals who designed it back in the mid-90s. Super Mario 64 has had an undeniable grasp on 3D gaming, whether directly or indirectly, ever since it was released back in 1996. And as seen by the culture today, I don't think it's going anywhere, anytime soon. Thank you for watching to the end. If you like this type of informative documentary type content and want to see more videos like it, I'd encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe to show the YouTube algorithm that you enjoyed watching the video. If you do those things, it really does improve the performance of my videos and the growth of my channel too. I'll see you next time.